President Donald Trump recently told Axios that he is considering what he described as a massive attack on Iran, adding that the United States is prepared and that Israel could join such an operation almost immediately if requested. At first glance, those remarks sound like another dramatic headline in an already tense relationship. But the more important question is not whether military action will happen. It is why such a message was delivered so publicly. In modern geopolitics, conflicts often begin long before the first aircraft takes off or the first missile is launched. Public statements can reshape military planning, influence financial markets, reassure allies, unsettle adversaries, and alter diplomatic calculations across an entire region. Even without a single shot being fired, words can become strategic instruments. That is why Trump's comments deserve closer attention. They may reveal something far more important than the prospect of immediate combat. To understand what is really unfolding, we first need to examine the broader strategic context behind these remarks. The immediate context is straightforward. In his interview with Axios, Trump stated that he was considering a massive attack against Iran and suggested that Israel would join the operation quickly if asked, while also emphasizing that the United States did not require additional partners to act. Those remarks are established facts. What remains uncertain is whether they represent an actual policy decision, a negotiating position, or a broader effort to influence strategic calculations. The comments emerged against a backdrop of long-standing tension between Washington and Tehran, with Israel continuing to view Iran's regional activities and military capabilities as major security concerns. In such an environment, public statements by national leaders often serve several purposes at once. They can reassure allies, warn adversaries, strengthen deterrence, or shape diplomatic negotiations before any operational orders are issued. No new combat operation has been officially announced. Yet the significance of these remarks extends beyond the interview itself. They become far more meaningful when viewed through the long history of U.S.-Iran confrontation. To understand why Trump's remarks immediately drew international attention, it is necessary to look beyond today's headlines and revisit the strategic rivalry that has shaped relations between Washington and Tehran for decades. The modern confrontation largely began with Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution, which transformed a close American partner into one of its most persistent geopolitical rivals. Since then, the relationship has been defined by recurring cycles of sanctions, diplomatic breakdowns, military tension, and periods of cautious engagement rather than lasting reconciliation. Over time, Iran developed a defense strategy built around asymmetric capabilities. Recognizing that it could not match the United States in conventional military power, Tehran invested heavily in missile programs, naval tactics designed for the Persian Gulf, and relationships with allied non-state armed groups across the Middle East. From Iran's perspective, these capabilities serve as deterrence by increasing the potential costs of any direct military campaign. Critics, however, argue that the same networks have expanded Iran's regional influence and heightened instability. Meanwhile, the United States has maintained a substantial military presence across the Gulf, while Israel has consistently viewed Iran's military ambitions and regional partnerships as major security challenges. Despite repeated crises, both sides have generally sought to avoid an uncontrollable regional war, relying instead on deterrence, limited responses, and carefully calibrated signaling. That long history of mutual distrust explains why even a single public statement today can reshape military planning, diplomatic messaging, and strategic calculations across the region. With that historical foundation in place, the deeper logic behind Trump's latest remarks becomes easier to understand. With that historical foundation established, the focus shifts from what was said to why it may have been said. Public threats issued by national leaders are rarely directed at only one audience. They can be aimed simultaneously at adversaries, allies, domestic audiences, and international partners. In strategic affairs, language itself can become a policy instrument, shaping expectations and influencing decisions before any military action is authorized. One possible explanation is deterrence. By publicly discussing the possibility of a major attack, a leader may seek to increase uncertainty for an adversary. If Iran cannot confidently predict whether the United States is prepared to act, its military planners may be forced to reconsider deployments, strengthen defensive positions, or delay activities perceived as provocative. The objective is not necessarily to initiate conflict, but to alter an opponent's calculations before conflict becomes unavoidable. Another possibility involves credibility. Following previous regional crises, any administration may wish to demonstrate that its warnings should be taken seriously. In international politics, deterrence depends not only on military capability, but also on perceived willingness to use it. Public statements can therefore reinforce the image of resolve, reassuring allies that security commitments remain credible, while reminding adversaries that certain actions could carry significant consequences. Those allies are an important part of the equation. Israel has consistently viewed Iran's military capabilities and regional influence as major security concerns, while several Gulf states continue to monitor developments closely. Strong public messaging from Washington may therefore serve to reassure partners that the United States remains engaged in regional security, even if no immediate military operation is planned. Such reassurance can strengthen alliances at a time of heightened uncertainty, yet there is another side to this strategic equation. Public threats can also function as coercive diplomacy, applying pressure in hopes of influencing negotiations without resorting to force. The public narrative may appear to be preparation for war, but the strategic reality can be far more complex. Credible military threats are sometimes intended precisely to avoid war by convincing an opponent that the costs of escalation outweigh any potential gains. From Iran's perspective, such statements are unlikely to go unanswered, even without direct retaliation. Military planners could disperse key assets, reinforce air defense networks, increase operational security, and coordinate more closely with regional partners. Rather than seeking conventional confrontation with a superior military power, Iran has historically emphasized asymmetric capabilities designed to complicate any military campaign and raise its potential costs. Intelligence agencies on all sides would also intensify efforts to monitor intentions, reducing uncertainty where possible while preparing for rapid changes in the security environment. This dynamic illustrates the greatest danger of strategic signaling: miscalculation. Actions intended as deterrence can be interpreted as preparation for attack, prompting defensive measures that appear offensive to the other side. In that environment, perception becomes almost as important as capability. Even if no strike ultimately occurs, these evolving calculations could still reshape the regional balance. And once that broader perspective comes into view, the implications extend far beyond Washington and Tehran. If the strategic calculations discussed so far remain confined to Washington and Tehran, their impact would already be significant. In reality, however, renewed military tensions between the United States and Iran have the potential to influence security and economic decisions across the Middle East and well beyond it. That is because the region occupies a central position in global energy production, maritime commerce, and international security planning. For neighboring Gulf states, any increase in military tension immediately raises questions about regional stability. Governments must evaluate the security of critical infrastructure, reassess defense coordination with partners, and prepare for the possibility that a localized crisis could spill across national borders. Israel would likewise continue monitoring Iranian military activity closely, while European governments would face renewed pressure to balance support for regional security with efforts to prevent further escalation through diplomacy. The economic consequences could be just as important as the military ones. Energy markets respond not only to physical disruptions, but also to expectations of future risk. Even without direct attacks on energy infrastructure or major shipping routes, prolonged uncertainty can influence oil prices, insurance costs, investment decisions, and broader market confidence. Maritime security in strategic waterways would receive increased attention, with commercial operators and naval forces alike adapting to a more uncertain operating environment. Major powers outside the region would also be watching carefully. China, as a major importer of Middle Eastern energy, has an interest in preserving stable supply routes, while Russia would closely observe any changes affecting regional power balances or broader competition with the United States. Their responses would likely combine diplomatic engagement with efforts to protect their own strategic interests rather than direct involvement in any confrontation. This broader picture highlights an important contrast. A military option that appears tactically effective could still produce long-term political and economic costs that extend far beyond its immediate objective. Likewise, avoiding military action does not necessarily eliminate strategic consequences because uncertainty itself shapes decisions made by governments, armed forces, businesses, and investors. The real question is no longer whether tensions rise, but what happens if neither side believes it can afford to appear weak. That naturally leads to the most important question of all: what comes next? Looking ahead, the future remains uncertain, and no single outcome should be treated as inevitable. Instead, policymakers and military planners are likely weighing several possible scenarios, each carrying its own opportunities, risks, and strategic calculations. The first scenario is continued military signaling without direct combat. Public warnings, additional force deployments, and visible military readiness could be used to maintain pressure on Iran while stopping short of authorizing strikes. Such an approach would seek to strengthen deterrence, reassure regional allies, and preserve diplomatic flexibility without immediately crossing the threshold into open conflict. A second possibility involves limited precision strikes against selected military objectives. If leaders conclude that deterrence alone has failed, they could authorize narrowly focused operations designed to achieve specific goals while avoiding a broader regional war. Even under this scenario, both sides would likely face strong incentives to prevent escalation from expanding beyond its initial scope. A third scenario centers on asymmetric retaliation. Rather than engaging in conventional military confrontation, Iran could respond through methods that have long formed part of its broader security strategy. These might include increased activity by aligned regional groups, pressure on maritime security, or other actions intended to impose costs without inviting a direct conventional conflict. Such developments could create a prolonged cycle of responses and counter-responses, making crisis management considerably more difficult. The fourth scenario points toward renewed diplomacy after a period of heightened pressure. History shows that periods of intense military signaling have sometimes been followed by negotiations rather than war. In this case, public threats could function primarily as leverage, strengthening bargaining positions while encouraging all parties to seek an outcome that avoids the costs of sustained conflict. None of these paths is guaranteed, and elements of more than one scenario could emerge simultaneously. The greatest uncertainty lies not only in deliberate decisions, but also in how those decisions are interpreted by others. History repeatedly demonstrates that crises often escalate through misunderstanding as much as intention. Managing perception, communication, and deterrence may therefore prove just as important as military capability itself. Ultimately, the significance of this story extends beyond any single statement because it reveals the complex dynamics that increasingly define modern geopolitical competition. That brings us back to the question that opened this documentary: why publicly raise the possibility of a massive attack before any new military operation has been announced? The answer may have less to do with predicting war than with shaping the strategic environment in which future decisions will be made. Whether combat resumes or not, the statement has already influenced calculations across governments, military headquarters, intelligence agencies, and financial markets. Allies are reassessing security commitments, adversaries are evaluating potential responses, and policymakers are considering both the opportunities and the risks created by heightened uncertainty. In modern geopolitics, deterrence depends not only on military capability, but also on credibility, signaling, and the ability to influence how others perceive intentions. The next phase will therefore be determined by more than decisions made in Washington alone. Tehran's interpretation of American signals, Israel's assessment of regional threats, and the reactions of Gulf states and other international actors will all shape the direction of events. Every move, every deployment, and every public statement will be weighed for clues about what comes next. History reminds us that major geopolitical turning points often emerge gradually rather than through a single dramatic event. Whether this moment becomes another temporary crisis or the beginning of a new phase in Middle Eastern security will depend on how competing powers manage deterrence, communication, and the ever-present risk of miscalculation. The next move may determine not only the future of U.S.-Iran relations, but the security architecture of the entire Middle East.